Autumn, 1878. Black Hills, Dakota Territory. The first bullet shattered the wagon's water barrel, sending a spray of precious liquid across the Black Hills as Rosalie Brennan threw herself over her 7-year-old daughter. Daisy clutched her rawhide hobby horse with white knuckles, her brown eyes wide with terror as another shot splintered the wood inches from their heads. "Stay down, sweetheart," Rosalie whispered, her voice barely audible over the thunder of pursuing hooves. The rope burns on her wrists, still raw from her escape. 3 hours earlier sent fire up her arms with every jolt of the stolen wagon. Behind them, 4 riders closed the distance with methodical precision. Deputy Lou's harsh laughter carried on the morning wind, but it was Sneaky Snake's cold silence that truly chilled Rosalie's blood. The man was a hunter patient and deadly, and she knew he would not stop until he had what Hugh Kensington wanted. The wagon lurched violently as it hit a prairie dog hole, throwing both mother and daughter hard against the side. Rosalie bit back a cry as her shoulders struck iron, but kept her arms wrapped protectively around Daisy. The child had endured too much, losing her father Patrick to that supposed mining accident 2 years past, and now this nightmare with Kensington's fraudulent guardianship claims. A rifle cracked behind them, the bullet close enough that Rosalie could smell gunpowder. Their 2 exhausted mares were faltering, foam flecking their mouths as they struggled across the uneven terrain. Through the dust and her own fear, she spotted thin columns of smoke rising from a depression ahead. "Mama, I see teepees," Daisy whispered, pointing with one small hand while maintaining her death grip on the carved toy. The Lakota encampment sat in a natural bowl beside a creek, perhaps 20 buffalo hide lodges arranged in the traditional circle. Horses grazed nearby, while people moved about their morning tasks, unaware of the violence racing toward them. Rosalie hauled back on the reins, bringing the mares to a sliding halt near the camp's edge. Before the wagon had fully stopped, she scooped Daisy into her arms and leaped down, stumbling but keeping her footing on the rocky ground. "Help us, please," she called out in English, then tried the few Lakota words Patrick had taught her. "Wicha King." The camp fell silent, except for the distant sound of their pursuers. A tall warrior emerged from the largest teepee, moving with fluid grace that spoke of countless battles survived. He wore buckskin leggings and a blue trade shirt with eagle feathers woven into his long black hair. Scars marked his hands and forearms, and his dark eyes held the sharp intelligence of a born leader. When his gaze fell on the hobby horse in Daisy's arms, something flickered across his features. Recognition mixed with old pain. His hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt, and Rosalie saw the slight tremor in his fingers. "Please," she said desperately. "He knows nothing about you. The man chasing us doesn't understand what you could mean to this." Before the warrior could respond, the 4 riders crested the rise. Hugh Kensington led them, his massive frame straining the seams of his expensive coat. At 52, he commanded through wealth and brutality rather than courage. But the matched Colts at his hip had seen plenty of use. "Now see here," Kensington's voice boomed across the camp. "Those 2 are thieves and kidnappers. I got federal papers saying that girl is my legal ward." The Lakota warrior stepped forward, placing himself between the mounted men and Rosalie. Around them, other warriors had emerged from the teepees, some carrying Winchester .73 Model 1873 rifles, others with traditional bows and arrows nocked. "This is Lakota ground," the warrior said in clear English. "State your business and move on." Kensington's face reddened above his gray beard. "I don't negotiate with savages. That woman kidnapped my ward, and I mean to have her back." "Your ward." The warrior's tone remained level. "The child appears well cared for by her mother." "That ain't her real mother." Sneaky Snake's nasal voice cut through the tension like a blade. The hired killer sat his horse with predatory stillness, his pale eyes never leaving the warrior's face. Woman's just hired help who got ideas above her station. The warrior looked back at Rosalie, and she met his gaze directly. Something passed between them, an understanding born of shared danger and mutual respect. "I am her mother, by blood and law," Rosalie said firmly. "Married to Patrick Brennan before witnesses. No man has claim over my daughter." She paused, studying the warrior's reaction, as she added more quietly, "That toy she holds, you've seen its like before." The warrior's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Whatever he recognized was causing him distress, but he mastered it with the discipline of a seasoned fighter. "I don't care what fairy tales you tell each other," Kensington snarled. "I got federal backing and armed men. Hand over the girl or face the consequences. Your paper law ends where our land begins." The warrior said simply, drawing a Henry Rifle Model 1860 rifle and levering a round into the chamber. The metallic sound echoed across the camp like a death knell. Snake's hand moved toward his pistol, but the warrior was already tracking him with the rifle barrel. "Easy there, Indian." Snake said, his voice soft as silk. "No need for anyone to get hurt. We just want the woman and child." "And I want many things," the warrior replied. "But wanting and taking are different matters." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Women moved children toward the back of the camp, while warriors took positions with practiced efficiency. The morning air grew thick with tension and the metallic taste of approaching violence. Snake was the first to break. Whether from overconfidence or simple bloodlust, he went for his gun with smooth, practiced motion. But the warrior had been waiting for it. His rifle boomed, and Snake's horse screamed as the bullet took it in the chest, sending both mount and rider tumbling in a spray of blood and dust. Chaos erupted. Deputy Lou fired wildly as his horse reared in terror. Kensington's other men, a scarred gunfighter called Texas Joe, and a young cowboy named Billy, tried to bring their weapons to bear. But arrows were already flying from concealment. One caught Texas Joe in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle, while another embedded itself in Billy's thigh. Rosalie threw herself down, covering Daisy with her body as lead and arrows filled the air above them. The smell of gunpowder mixed with dust and blood, and horses screamed in pain and terror. Through it all, she kept her eyes on the Lakota warrior, watching as he moved with deadly precision, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. The fight lasted perhaps 2 minutes. When the smoke cleared, Snake lay groaning beside his dead horse, an arrow through his gun arm, and blood seeping from a scalp wound. Texas Joe had managed to stay mounted, but was swaying weakly while Billy clung to his saddle horn with both hands. Only Lou and Kensington remained unscathed, though both looked shaken. "This ain't over," Kensington shouted as they prepared to retreat, Snake draped across Lou's saddle. "I'll be back with federal marshals and cavalry. You'll all hang for this." As the sound of hoofbeats faded, the warrior lowered his rifle and approached Rosalie. She was still crouched protectively over Daisy, and he moved slowly, his movements calm and unthreatening. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Rosalie took his offered hand, surprised by the gentleness of his grip, despite the calluses that spoke of years handling weapons. "No, we're unharmed. Thank you." He nodded and then looked down at Daisy, who was staring at him with wide, curious eyes. The little girl held up her rawhide horse, and the warrior's face went very still. "Where did you get this?" he asked softly. Daisy looked to her mother for permission before answering. "I found it in a burned place by the creek 2 summers ago. Mama said I could keep it if it truly had no owner." The warrior reached out with one finger to touch the toy's mane, where 3 small notches had been carved in a precise pattern. His hand shook slightly, and Rosalie saw raw grief flicker across his features before he mastered it. "My name is Chasky," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "What are yours?" "I'm Rosalie Brennan, and this is my daughter Daisy. We owe you our lives." "You owe me nothing. But we should speak of many things, and soon." His eyes remained fixed on the carved horse. "That man will return as he promised, with more guns and federal authority." A middle-aged Lakota woman approached her face, kind but concerned. She wore a calico dress over traditional leggings, and her graying hair was braided with colored ribbons that caught the morning light. "This is Malia, my cousin," Chask explained. "She's right, you both need food and rest, and we need to understand exactly what we're facing." As they walked toward the teepee, Rosalie couldn't shake the feeling that their arrival here was more than chance. The way Chask had looked at Daisy's toy, the recognition and pain in his eyes. There was a story here, one that might explain why a Lakota warrior would risk his people's safety for strangers. Malia worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning the rope burns on Rosalie's wrists with heated water, then applying a salve made from bear grease and willow bark. The traditional remedy stung at first, but quickly soothed the inflamed skin. "You were bound recently," Malia observed in careful English. "This man, he kept you prisoner." Rosalie nodded, wincing as the older woman cleaned a particularly deep abrasion. 4 days, maybe 5. He claimed legal guardianship over Daisy after her father died, said he was protecting her inheritance. But I knew he only wanted the mining claim Patrick left us. Chasky looked up from sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scraping of steel on stone never pausing. "What kind of claim?" "Bronze Canyon, the prospector's nickname for a narrow gulch in the Black Hills about 30 miles from here. Patrick found silver traces there before he died in the cave-in. Nothing rich, mind you, but enough to keep us fed if worked carefully." Rosalie's voice grew bitter. "Kensington's been buying up small claims throughout the area, sometimes fairly, sometimes through threats and violence. When Patrick died, suddenly there were papers saying he'd made Kensington Daisy's guardian in case anything happened to me." "Papers can be forged," Chaske said quietly, testing the knife's edge against his thumb. "Especially in places where few can read and judges can be bought." Around them, the camp had settled into the watchful routine of people constantly ready for violence. Women worked on clothing and tools while keeping alert eyes on their children. Men maintained weapons and tended horses, but positioned themselves to monitor the surrounding terrain. A young warrior approached and spoke rapidly in Lakota, gesturing toward the direction their enemies had fled. Chaske listened intently, then replied in the same language, before turning to Rosalie. "Wikasa says they've made camp 5 miles east, near the old Buffalo Crossing. More men have joined them, at least 10, maybe 12. They're not hiding their numbers." "He wants us to see them," Rosalie said with sudden understanding. "Show strength to frighten us into surrender." "Perhaps. Or perhaps he hopes to frighten my people into abandoning you." Chaska's expression was grim. "He doesn't understand Lakota hospitality. When we give protection, it's not withdrawn because of threats." One of the older warriors spoke up, his voice gruff with age, but carrying undeniable authority. Chaske translated, "Tatanka asks why we should risk women and children for strangers. He says white troubles are not our troubles." Before Rosalie could respond, Chaske held up his hand and spoke in formal Lakota that needed no translation. He was making a decision, taking responsibility for whatever came next. When he finished, most of the men nodded acceptance, though a few looked skeptical. "Tell Tatanka I have seen the child's toy." Chaske said in English, then repeated it in Lakota. Tell him this trouble may be our trouble after all. This sparked immediate discussion among the warriors. Rosalie caught the word for brother Chie, spoken several times, and saw how some men looked at her and Daisy with new interest and growing anger. What do they need to know? She asked quietly. Chaske was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the hobby horse in Daisy's hands. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and barely controlled rage. I had a younger brother, Chikala. 5 winters passed. He was killed when our winter camp was attacked by white men seeking to drive us from good hunting grounds. They burned everything, killed the men who resisted, scattered the women and children to the winds. His jaw worked silently before he continued. Chikala was gifted with his hands. He carved toys for children, always with his mark, 3 notches in the mane or tail, just like those. Rosalie felt the world shift beneath her. You think Daisy's toy. I know it. That's my brother's work, as certain as I know my own face. Chaske's dark eyes met hers, and she saw depths of pain and fury that made her breath catch. The question is how it came to be in a burned place by the creek, and why the man claiming guardianship over your daughter would pursue you with such desperate determination. The implications hit like a physical blow. If Kensington's men had been involved in the attack that killed Chaske's brother, then Daisy's innocent discovery had connected them to something much larger and more dangerous than a simple land grab. The burned place was near Bronze Canyon, she said slowly. Daisy found the toy among the ruins of what looked like it might have been a small cabin or shelter. Malia, who had been listening intently, spoke in halting English. Tsikala. He sometimes stayed in old trapper cabin near the Silver Rocks. Safe place when winter was hard and traveling dangerous. Until it wasn't, Chaske said grimly. The council continued in rapid Lakota voices, growing heated as the implications became clear. Finally, Chaske stood and addressed the group in formal tones that carried the weight of absolute authority. When he finished, the men dispersed to prepare for travel, their movements urgent and purposeful. We break camp within the hour, he told Rosalie. There's a place near Willow Springs, a small settlement west of Deadwood, in the Black Hills, Dakota Territory, where we can be safe while learning more about this Kensington and his federal papers. But the journey will be hard and dangerous, especially with pursuers who know the country. Anywhere is safer than waiting here for him to return with cavalry, Rosalie replied. Daisy and I are ready to travel. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. The little girl had been through so much already, and now they were asking her to flee across hostile territory with winter coming on and killers on their trail. Yet what choice did they have? As the camp sprang into action around them, Malia pressed a cup of strong coffee into Rosalie's hands and settled Daisy more comfortably on a buffalo robe. The child had been remarkably quiet throughout the morning's violence, but now she looked up at Chaske with the unsettling directness that only children could manage. "Are you going to help us?" she asked. Chaske knelt beside her, bringing himself to her eye level with the natural ease of someone accustomed to children. "Yes, little one, I promise you that." "Good," Daisy said with simple faith. "Mama worries too much, but I think you're strong enough to keep us safe." Despite everything they faced, Rosalie found herself smiling at her daughter's calm acceptance. But as she watched Chaske interact with Daisy, saw the careful gentleness he showed toward the child, despite the violence that had just ended, she felt something stirring in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude or relief. It had been more than 2 years since Patrick's death, 2 years of struggling alone to protect and provide for her daughter. The feeling of having someone else share that burden, even temporarily, was both welcome and terrifying. She caught herself studying the line of Chasky's shoulders as he helped Daisy gather her few possessions, noting the easy strength in his movements and the way his scarred hands could be so gentle with a child. When he looked up and caught her watching, something passed between them, an awareness that went beyond their desperate circumstances. Heat rose in her cheeks, and she looked away quickly, but not before she saw the answering recognition in his dark eyes. Within minutes, the camp had transformed into a traveling column, with practiced efficiency that spoke of lives spent in motion. Teepees came down in coordinated sequence, supplies were loaded onto travois, pulled by sturdy ponies, and children were lifted onto gentle horses with the easy competence of people born to the saddle. Rosalie found herself mounted on a calm mare, with Daisy settled securely in front of her, while Chaske rode alongside on a tall gelding that moved with the controlled power of a warhorse. His rifle lay across his saddle, and his attention constantly swept the surrounding terrain with the vigilance of someone who knew death could come from any direction. "How long to Willow Springs?" she asked as they began moving across the grassland. "If we push hard and avoid contact with our pursuers, we could be there by tomorrow evening," Chaske replied. "But first we must cross Storm Creek, and the spring melt has made it treacherous. More importantly, we need to stay ahead of Kensington's men, while not leaving a trail a blind man could follow." As they rode, Rosalie fell into the rhythm of travel with these people, who seemed so comfortable with movement and change. The Lakota around her rode with an alertness born of generations of life on the open plains where danger could appear at any moment, but where freedom was measured in endless horizons. Behind them, thin columns of smoke still rose from where Kensington's reinforced camp now waited with grim patience. The rancher was no fool. He would be gathering men and weapons, calling in favors from corrupt officials, and planning his next move with the methodical precision of someone who had built an empire through violence and intimidation. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first scattered drops of rain began to fall from clouds that seemed to appear from nowhere. The weather in Dakota Territory could change with deadly swiftness, and Rosalie could see concern growing on the faces of their Lakota protectors. "Storm coming," Chaske said, raising his voice over the rising wind. "We need shelter, but not where they expect us to go." What followed was 2 hours of the most miserable travel Rosalie had ever experienced. The storm struck with vicious intensity, transforming the afternoon into a gray nightmare of driving rain and wind that cut through their clothes like knives. They took shelter in a grove of bent cottonwoods, huddled together for warmth, while the worst of the weather hammered down around them. Chaske appeared at Rosalie's side, with a thick buffalo wool blanket wrapping it around both mother and daughter, without waiting for permission. His hands brushed hers as he adjusted the covering, and despite the cold rain, she felt warmth spread through her at the contact. "We rebuild from what remains," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the storm. "That's all anyone can do." She looked at him through the driving rain, seeing not just the warrior who had saved them, but the man who had lost his brother, his wife, everything he had once called home. "And when there's nothing left to rebuild from, then we become the foundation for whatever comes next." His dark eyes held hers with steady intensity. "Your daughter will grow strong because you refuse to let her future be stolen. My brother lives on in the toy she carries. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not for what was, but for what might be." The words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning, and Rosalie found herself understanding that this conversation was about more than survival. It was about the fragile hope that two broken people might build something lasting together, even in the midst of chaos and violence. "Thank you." She managed her voice, nearly lost in the howling wind. He nodded and started to move away, but Daisy's small voice stopped him. "Will the bad men follow us in this storm?" Chaske knelt beside them, bringing his face close to be heard over the tempest. Wise men don't travel in weather like this little one. But the men chasing you, I don't think wisdom is their strongest trait." Despite their circumstances, Daisy giggled at this observation, and even Rosalie found herself smiling. There was something about Chaska's steady presence that made their situation seem less hopeless, as though his quiet confidence was proof that they would survive whatever came next. But even as she allowed herself a moment of hope, she could see movement in the distance, dark shapes moving with purpose through the driving rain. Their pursuers were indeed following, pushing forward despite the weather, with the determination of men who had too much at stake to let a little storm stop them. "And they're coming," she said, pointing through the rain. Chaske followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "Wikasa," he called to the young warrior who had been watching their back trail. "How many?" 15, maybe 20, came the reply. "And they're pushing their horses hard." The decision was made in seconds. They would have to abandon the shelter and make a run for Storm Creek, hoping to reach the crossing before their pursuers could close the distance. But as they mounted up and rode out into the teeth of the storm, Rosalie knew they were gambling everything on reaching water that might be too high to cross safely. The race across the storm-lashed grassland became a nightmare of mud, wind, and constant fear. Their horses struggled against the treacherous footing, while behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer. Twice, Rosalie heard the distinctive crack of rifle fire, though whether the shots came close or were simply warning attempts, she couldn't tell. When they finally reached Storm Creek, her heart sank. The normally modest waterway had become a raging torrent swollen with runoff from the hills and running far too fast and deep for safe crossing. On the far bank, salvation waited in the form of broken country where they could lose their pursuers, but first they had to survive the water. "We have to try," Chaske said, studying the rushing current with the eye of someone who had crossed many dangerous rivers. "They'll be on us in minutes." What followed was one of the most terrifying experiences of Rosalie's life. Chaske took point, his powerful gelding fighting the current, as he worked his way toward the far bank with a rope tied around his waist. Behind him, other riders followed the lifeline he had established, each helping to anchor the chain for those who came after. Rosalie found herself mid-crossing when disaster struck. The woman behind her, one of the younger Lakota wives, lost control of her horse as the animal stumbled in the swift current. Both rider and mount were swept downstream toward a tangle of fallen trees that would have meant certain death. Without hesitation, Chaske turned back into the torrent, his gelding plunging deeper into the treacherous water as he fought upstream to reach the drowning woman. Rosalie watched in terror, clutching Daisy against her chest as he managed to get a rope around the woman's waist just before her horse was pulled under by the current. For a moment that seemed to last forever, all three were swept toward the deadly debris. But Chaske's rope held, and the other warriors on shore managed to haul them to safety just as their pursuers reached the near bank. Kensington himself led the group, his face purple with rage as he saw his quarry escaping across the flood. "You can't run forever," he bellowed across the water. "I got federal authority and unlimited resources. There's nowhere you can hide." Chaske had remounted and positioned himself where Kensington could see him clearly. Water streamed from his clothes and hair, but his rifle was dry and ready. "We're not hiding. We're leading you exactly where we want you to go. This ain't your fight, savage." Snake had survived his earlier wounds and was back in the saddle, though his left arm hung useless at his side. "Give us the woman and child, and maybe we let you live." In response, Chaske raised his rifle and put a bullet into the water directly in front of Snake's horse. The animal reared violently, nearly dumping its rider into the creek. "Next shot goes through your heart," Chaske shouted back. The confrontation across the water stretched taut for several minutes. before Kensington seemed to reach a decision. Fine. You want to play this game? We'll play it. But when I catch you, and I will catch you, that little girl won't be the only one who suffers. As the pursuers withdrew to find another crossing, Chaske turned to organize his people for the next stage of their flight. But Rosalie could see the concern in his eyes. Their enemies had more men, better weapons, and the backing of corrupt federal authority. Time was running out, and their options were narrowing with each passing hour. They pushed hard through the afternoon, following game trails and stream beds that would make tracking difficult, but slowed their own progress. Daisy had developed a fever from the cold and wet, and despite Malia's best efforts with traditional remedies, the child grew weaker with each mile. She needs real shelter and medicine, Rosalie said desperately as they paused to rest the horses. As if sensing her thoughts, Chaske guided his horse closer to hers. There's someone in Willow Springs who might help, he said quietly. Dr. Malcolm, he treated my cousin's boy last winter after a horse kicked him. Good man doesn't ask questions when children need help. You know Dr. Malcolm? Rosalie asked with surprise. We've traded before. He pays fair prices for medicinal plants, and he's one of the few white men in town who treats our people with respect. Chaske reached out to feel Daisy's forehead, his touch gentle despite the calluses. The fever's not dangerous yet, but if it gets worse... He didn't need to finish. They both knew what untreated fever could mean for a child, especially one who had already endured so much stress and hardship. Night was falling as they finally reached the outskirts of Willow Springs, but instead of riding directly into town, Chaske led them to an abandoned homestead about 2 miles out. The buildings were empty, but still sound, and they offered shelter from both the weather and prying eyes. We rest here tonight, he announced. Tomorrow, we learn exactly what kind of legal authority Kensington claims to have, and we find evidence to challenge it. As they settled into the dubious comfort of the old cabin, Rosalie found herself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this point. It had started with a child's innocent discovery of a toy in burned ruins, but it had grown into something that threatened everything she held dear. But for the first time since her escape from Kensington's ranch, she felt something besides fear and desperation. She felt the strength that came from having allies, people willing to risk their lives for justice and the protection of the innocent. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would not face it alone. Outside, the wind howled through the abandoned buildings, and somewhere in the darkness, their enemies were still searching. But inside the cabin, wrapped in Chaske's buffalo robe, with Daisy sleeping fitfully against her chest, Rosalie allowed herself a moment of hope. The hobby horse lay beside them, its carved features seeming to watch over the sleeping child, with the patient wisdom of something that had survived fire and loss to find new purpose. Soon, very soon, that little toy might finally speak its truth to the world. And when it did, Hugh Kensington would learn that some things were more dangerous than money, more powerful than corruption, and more enduring than the greed that drove men to murder. Dawn came gray and cold, with frost glittering on the abandoned homestead's broken windows. Rosalie woke to find Chaske already up and moving, checking weapons, and speaking quietly with his warriors. Daisy's fever had broken during the night, but the child was still weak and pale. How is she? Chaske asked, kneeling beside them with a cup of bitter but warming tea made from pine needles and willow bark. Better, I think. The fever's gone, but she needs real food and proper rest. Rosalie helped Daisy sit up to drink, noting how the little girl's hands trembled with exhaustion. We'll get both in town, Chaske promised. But first, we need to understand what we're truly fighting. Wikasa scouted during the night. Kensington's men are camped just east of town, and they've been joined by others. Federal marshals, maybe, or men wearing federal badges. The implications were sobering. If Kensington truly had legitimate federal backing, their situation had just become far more dangerous. Fighting corrupt local officials was one thing, but taking on the United States government was quite another. "There's someone else we should talk to," Rosalie said slowly. "Miss Winifred McReady, the schoolteacher. She's educated, she can read legal documents, and she has access to the courthouse records. If anyone can help us prove Kensington's papers are forged, it's her." "Can she be trusted?" Chaskey asked. "She helped us before when we had nowhere else to go after Patrick died. If she's still the same woman I knew, yes, she can be trusted with our lives." They made their way into Willow Springs just after full sunrise, moving carefully through back streets and alleys to avoid detection. The town was stirring to life, with smoke rising from chimneys, and the familiar sounds of a frontier community beginning its daily routine. Dr. Malcolm's office was above the general store, reached by an outside staircase that creaked ominously under their weight. The physician himself answered their knock, a small, neat man in his 50s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mrs. Brennan," he exclaimed in his slight Scottish accent, and then took in their bedraggled appearance and obvious exhaustion. "Good Lord, what's happened to you? And who are these people?" "Dr. Malcolm, we need your help desperately," Rosalie said, pushing past him into the office. "Daisy's been ill, and there are men hunting us, dangerous men with federal authority." Malcolm's professional instincts overcame his surprise. He examined Daisy quickly, but thoroughly, checking her temperature and pulse while asking quiet questions about her symptoms. Finally, he straightened with obvious relief. "She'll be fine with rest and proper nutrition. The fever's broken cleanly, and there's no sign of serious complications." He turned to Rosalie with concern. "But what's this about federal marshals? What trouble have you gotten into?" As Rosalie explained their situation, Malcolm's expression grew increasingly grave. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing risks and obligations. "Hugh Kensington claimed legal guardianship," he asked finally. "That's interesting. He was here just last week asking very specific questions about your husband's death. Wanted to know if there had been anything suspicious about the mining accident." "What did you tell him?" Chaskey asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the office. Malcolm looked at the Lakota warrior with curiosity, but no fear. "The truth as I knew it. Patrick Brennan died when an improperly shored tunnel collapsed on him. Tragic, but hardly uncommon in amateur mining operations." He paused, something flickering in his eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before. But Kensington seemed disappointed by that answer, as though he'd been hoping for something more dramatic. He was looking for an excuse to challenge the inheritance, Rosalie said with sudden understanding. If Patrick had died under suspicious circumstances, it might have given legal grounds to question Daisy's claim to the mine. "Exactly what I thought." Malcolm agreed, though his voice carried a subtle tension that hadn't been there moments before. "Which makes me very curious about these guardianship papers he's supposedly carrying." A new voice spoke from the doorway. "Then perhaps we should examine them." They turned to see a woman in her 30s, dressed in the practical but well-made clothing of a schoolteacher. Her brown hair was pinned back severely, but her eyes held both intelligence and determination that spoke of inner strength forged by frontier hardships. "Miss Winifred," Rosalie said with genuine relief. "Thank heaven you're here." Winifred McReady had come west, after losing her fiancé in the war, carrying nothing but her education and an iron determination to make a difference in the world. She'd been teaching in Willow Springs for 3 years, earning respect for both her learning and her courage in facing down drunken cowboys and corrupt officials alike. I saw the activity at Kensington's camp, she explained, moving into the room and closing the door behind her. Federal marshals, or men claiming to be marshals anyway. When I heard you might be in town, I thought you'd need help. Can you get us access to the courthouse records? Chaske asked directly. Winifred smiled grimly. I have keys to the building the school board meets there monthly, and I often prepare the room. If these papers exist, they'll be filed with the county clerk, and as an elected official, I have every right to examine public records. Malcolm cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried an odd note of strain. Perhaps I should stay here, he said, in case anyone comes looking for evidence that you've been here. I can provide an alibi if needed. Something in his tone made Chaske look at him sharply, but the physician was already turning away, busying himself with organizing his medical supplies with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Within the hour, they had organized a plan. Malcolm would remain in his office, treating any injuries that might result from their activities. Winifred would accompany Rosalie and Chaske to the courthouse, while the other Lakota warriors took positions around the town to watch for threats. The courthouse was a simple wooden building that served multiple functions for the growing community. Winifred led them through the back entrance, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged there. County clerk's office is on the ground floor, she whispered as they made their way through darkened hallways. But we'll need to be very careful with any light too much will be visible from the street. The office was cramped and dusty, filled with filing cabinets and stacks of papers that represented the bureaucratic foundation of frontier civilization. Winifred lit a small oil lamp and began searching through the most recent documents, while Rosalie and Chaske kept watch at the windows. Here it is, she said after several tense minutes. Petition for guardianship filed 5 days ago. Hugh Kensington requesting custody of Daisy Brennan, minor child, on grounds that her mother is morally unfit, and the child has inherited valuable property requiring experienced management. What specific grounds does he claim? Rosalie asked, though she dreaded the answer. Winifred scanned the document by lamplight. He alleges you are of loose moral character, given to drink and improper association, unable to provide adequate care and education for the child. There are sworn statements from 3 witnesses supporting these claims. All lies, Rosalie said fiercely. I've never touched strong drink in my life, and my only improper associations have been with the men Kensington himself employs. I believe you, Winifred said. But the question is whether we can prove it in court. Who are these witnesses? She read the names aloud. Deputy Lou Garrett, Samuel Snake Morrison, and Martha Crawley. Rosalie recognized the last name with a sinking heart. Martha was a prostitute who worked in the saloon at Kensington's ranch, a woman desperate enough to say anything for money. We need to find the original probate documents, Chaske said. Papers showing that Patrick Brennan never appointed any guardian for his daughter and proof of the child's legitimate inheritance. They searched for another 20 minutes, working by the dim light of the oil lamp, while listening constantly for sounds of discovery from outside. Finally, Winifred found what they were looking for in a separate filing cabinet. Patrick's will properly witnessed and filed, she announced. He left everything to his wife and daughter, with no mention of any guardian or outside administrator. She paused, studying another document attached to the file. But there's something else here, a later paper supposedly signed by Patrick just before his death, naming Kensington as Daisy's guardian in case of emergency. Rosalie leaned closer to examine the document. Even in the dim light, something looked wrong about it. The handwriting, she said slowly. It's not Patrick's hand. Are you certain? Chaske asked. Absolutely. Patrick had very distinctive handwriting he learned to write from Irish monks, and his letters always had those characteristic flourishes. This is written by someone else trying to copy his style. Winifred held the paper closer to the lamp, studying it with the trained eye of an educator. The ink is wrong too. This was written with a steel pen in commercial ink. But I remember Patrick always used a quill pen he carved himself, and he made his own ink from oak galls and iron. He helped me with some school records before he died, and I remember commenting on his old-fashioned methods. "Can we prove forgery in court?" Chaske asked. "Possibly, but we'd need expert testimony and time to gather evidence," Winifred replied. "And from the sounds outside, time is exactly what we don't have." Through the window, they could see movement in the street, armed men taking positions around the courthouse, while others searched nearby buildings. Their hiding place had been discovered, or was about to be. "Back door," Chaske said urgently. "Now." But as they reached the rear entrance, they found their escape route blocked by two of Kensington's men, both carrying rifles and wearing the hard expressions of professional killers. "Well, well," said the larger of the two, a scarred man they hadn't seen before. "Look what we caught sneaking around in the dark. Breaking and entering is a serious crime, even for school teachers and their Indian friends." Chaske's hand moved toward his knife, but Winifred stepped forward with surprising calm. "I have every right to be in this building," she said firmly. "I'm here on official school board business examining public records, as is my legal privilege." "In the dark with these two?" The gunman's tone was skeptical, but not entirely dismissive. He'd clearly been told to avoid unnecessary violence, if possible. "The lamp failed while we were working. These people are helping me secure important documents for safekeeping." Winifred's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. The explanation was thin, but delivered with such confidence that both gunmen hesitated. That moment of uncertainty was all Chaske needed. Moving with deadly speed, he drew his knife and pressed it against the throat of the nearest man while simultaneously grabbing his rifle. "Drop your weapons," he said quietly. "Both of you. Now." The standoff lasted only seconds before both men complied, but the sound of the confrontation had attracted attention from the street. Shouts erupted from multiple directions as Kensington's search party converged on the courthouse. "This way," Winifred said, leading them toward a side door that opened onto an alley between the courthouse and the barbershop. "I know where we can hide until things calm down." But even as they slipped into the narrow alley, Rosalie realized that things were not going to calm down. Kensington had committed too much to this course of action, risked too much politically and financially to accept defeat now. The confrontation she had been dreading was finally at hand, and it would be resolved only when one side or the other was completely destroyed. Behind them, the courthouse door burst open, and angry voices filled the night air. Their time for legal maneuvering and evidence gathering had run out. Now they would have to face their enemies with nothing but courage, cunning, and the desperate determination of people with everything to lose. The hiding place Winifred led them to was a root cellar beneath the general store, accessed through a concealed trapdoor behind stacks of flour barrels. The space was cramped and musty, barely large enough for the three of them, but it offered concealment and a chance to plan their next move. "I discovered this when I first came to town," Winifred explained as they crouched in the narrow underground chamber. "The previous storekeeper used it during the war to hide supplies from Confederate raiders. The current owner doesn't even know it exists." Above them, they could hear the systematic search continuing, boots on wooden floors, furniture being overturned, voices calling back and forth as Kensington's men scoured every building in town. The hunt had clearly escalated beyond a simple civil matter about child custody. They're treating this like a military operation. Rosalie whispered, her anger overriding her fear. As though we're armed insurrectionists, instead of a mother trying to protect her child. To men like Kensington, anyone who threatens their power is an enemy of the state. Chasky replied grimly. He'll use whatever authority he can claim to justify whatever violence serves his purposes. Through the floorboards above, they could hear Sheriff Morrison's voice raised in heated argument with someone else, undoubtedly Kensington or one of his supposed federal marshals. Morrison was an honest man by frontier standards, but he was also practical and politically aware. If Kensington truly had federal backing, and the sheriff would have little choice but to cooperate. We need to get out of town, Chasky said after listening to the search for several more minutes. But first we have to collect Daisy and the others from Dr. Malcolm's office. That's assuming they're still free. Winifred pointed out grimly. For all we know, Kensington's men have already arrested everyone who helped us. The possibility sent ice through Rosalie's veins. The thought of her daughter in Kensington's hands, helpless and frightened, was almost more than she could bear. But before she could give in to panic, new sounds from above caught their attention. Footsteps moved slowly and deliberately among the flour barrels, pausing occasionally, as though someone was examining the storage area more carefully than the previous searchers. These weren't the boots of hired gunmen. They moved with the careful precision of someone who knew about hiding places and secret passages. A voice called out in accented English, I know you're down there somewhere. I saw you go into the alley, but you didn't come out the other end. There has to be another way. The voice was young male and carried a German accent that Rosalie didn't recognize. But Chasky tensed with recognition. Conrad, he whispered. One of Kensington's hired hands. German immigrant, maybe 20 years old. Different from the others, frightened, not vicious. You know him? Rosalie asked. We've met. He tried to warn me once when I was trading horses at Kensington's ranch, said his boss was planning to cheat me on the price. Decent heart, but caught up in circumstances beyond his control. The voice continued from above, closer now, and tinged with desperation. Please, if you're listening, I don't want to find you. But they'll kill me if I don't try. They have my sister Anna working in the ranch house, and they've threatened to hurt her if I don't cooperate. Conrad's distress sounded genuine, but it could also be an elaborate trap. Kensington was certainly clever enough to use the young man's obvious decency as bait. My sister is only 16. Conrad continued, his voice now almost directly above their hiding place. She came to America with nothing but hope for a better life, and now she's trapped in that place like a slave. They say worse things will happen to her if I fail them. Winifred looked at Chasky questioningly. The Lakota warrior was clearly wrestling with a difficult decision: trust a man who worked for their enemy or remain hidden and risk discovery by less sympathetic searchers. He's telling the truth about the sister, Winifred whispered. I've seen the girl in town occasionally. She comes in for supplies, sometimes always with bruises, always terrified. Poor thing barely speaks English. Chasky made his decision. Moving carefully, he pushed up against the trapdoor, lifting it just enough to speak. Conrad, he said quietly, down here. The young German's face appeared in the opening, pale and drawn with exhaustion and fear. He was perhaps 20, with the sun-weathered look of someone who worked hard outdoors, but his blue eyes held a gentleness that spoke of fundamental decency despite his current employers. Thank God, Conrad breathed. I was afraid I'd have to keep searching, and I'm running out of places to look convincingly. What's the situation outside? Chask asked. Bad and getting worse. Kensington's brought in more men, including 2 who claim to be federal marshals. They've got papers authorizing them to arrest you on charges of kidnapping, theft, and inciting Indian violence against lawful authority. Conrad's expression was grim. But there's something else you need to know. They've taken hostages. Rosalie's heart clenched. Daisy. She's safe for now, locked up with Dr. Malcolm and several other townspeople in the jail. Kensington's using them to force cooperation from anyone who might help you. Conrad paused, his voice growing even more troubled. But he's also made it clear that if you don't surrender by dawn, he'll start making examples. And there's something else. Something about Dr. Malcolm that doesn't seem right. What do you mean? Winifred asked sharply. Conrad hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to reveal. When they brought him in, he didn't fight like the others. And I saw him talking quietly with one of Kensington's men, real secretive-like. Could be nothing but... The implication hung in the air like poison. If Dr. Malcolm was compromised, whether through fear, blackmail, or worse, then their situation had just become far more perilous than they had imagined. There's more, Conrad continued reluctantly. Kensington's not planning to take you back for trial. The orders he's given his men: once you're captured, you'll be shot while trying to escape. All of you. Then we don't get captured, Chask said with grim finality. Conrad, are you willing to help us? Really help, not just avoid finding us. The young German was quiet for a moment, wrestling with loyalties and fears that had shaped his life since arriving in America. Finally, he nodded. Yes. Anna and I came here to escape the violence in the old country, but we found something worse. If helping you means freeing her from that monster, then I'll do whatever it takes. Good. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're facing. How many men does Kensington have, and where are they positioned? Conrad provided a detailed report that painted a grim picture. Kensington had assembled nearly 30 armed men, including the supposed federal marshal's local deputies on his payroll, and hired gunfighters from as far away as Kansas City. They had the town essentially under martial law, with checkpoints on all the roads and sentries watching every building. The hostages are being held in the jail, but it's heavily guarded, Conrad explained. And Kensington himself is staying in the hotel with his inner circle, planning what he calls the final solution. But there's something else that might matter. He's been asking specific questions about Bronze Canyon, about what documents might be stored there. What kind of questions? Chaske asked. About mining surveys, correspondence, anything that might prove the mine is worth more than the original silver claim suggested. Conrad's expression grew troubled. And he's been particularly interested in whether anyone has been there recently, whether there might be evidence of other activities. The implications were clear. Kensington knew that Bronze Canyon held proof of his crimes, and he was willing to kill everyone who might have seen that evidence. This wasn't just about kidnapping or even murder. It was about covering up a conspiracy that reached far beyond one corrupt rancher. How long before the cavalry arrives? Chask asked. 2 days, maybe 3. The nearest garrison is at Fort Meade, and it'll take time to organize a response. Conrad leaned closer. But you should know he's not waiting for the army. Tomorrow night he plans to storm whatever hideout you found and finish this himself. He can't risk you escaping to tell your story elsewhere. As Conrad disappeared back into the search, leaving them to plan their next move, Rosalie felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. Surrender meant death for all of them, but fighting back against such overwhelming odds seemed equally hopeless. Yet somewhere in this nightmare, her daughter was depending on her to find a way out. There is one option, Chaske said slowly, as though reading her thoughts. It's dangerous beyond measure, but it might be our only chance. What? Rosalie asked, though she suspected she already knew. We go to ground. We can defend Bronze Canyon. Force them to come to us on terrain of our choosing, where their numbers mean less and their federal authority counts for nothing. His dark eyes met hers. But first we have to rescue the hostages. We can't leave innocent people to die for helping us. Winifred nodded grimly. The jail isn't as secure as they think. There's a back entrance through the basement that connects to the old mine shaft beneath the town. If we can create enough distraction. And then, Rosalie asked. Then we make our stand, Chaska replied. All of us together at the place where this all began. If we're going to die, we die fighting for the truth. But even as they prepared to leave their hiding place and begin the most dangerous night of their lives, a nagging doubt crept into Rosalie's mind. Conrad's words about Dr. Malcolm echoed in her thoughts, and she found herself wondering how well she really knew the man who had seemed so trustworthy, so willing to help. In a world where corruption and violence seemed to rule, could anyone truly be trusted completely? The rescue of the hostages began just after midnight, when the guards were tired and the town had settled into an uneasy quiet. Conrad had managed to unlock the back door of the jail, and Winifred led them through the maze of tunnels beneath Willow Springs that few people knew existed. The basement entrance connected to an old mining shaft that had been sealed when the town was built. But persistent flooding had weakened the barriers enough for determined people to break through. They emerged in the jail's cellar directly below the cells where Kensington was holding his prisoners. Dr. Malcolm was the first to see them, his face lighting with what appeared to be relief and concern, as Chaski's shadowy form appeared at the base of the stairs. Behind him, several other townspeople who had shown them kindness were crowded into cells meant for common drunks and petty thieves. Mrs. Brennan, Malcolm whispered urgently. Thank God you're alive. They told us you'd been killed trying to escape. But something in his voice, a note of strain that hadn't been there before, made Rosalie study his face more carefully in the dim light. His hands were shaking and there was sweat on his forehead despite the cool night air. Where's Daisy? Rosalie asked, her heart hammering as she saw no sign of her daughter among the prisoners. Separate cell upstairs, Malcolm replied quickly. They're keeping her isolated, using her as their primary leverage against you. Chaske was already working on the cell locks with tools Conrad had provided, but the sound of metal on metal seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. Above them they could hear guards moving around, and it would only be a matter of time before someone investigated. How many guards upstairs? Chaske asked in barely audible whisper. 3, maybe 4, replied George Morrison, the general store owner. They change shifts every few hours, but they're getting careless because they think you're trapped somewhere in town. The locks yielded to Chaske's patient work, and within minutes, the adult prisoners were free. But getting to Daisy meant going upstairs past alert guards and retrieving a frightened child without raising an alarm that would bring 30 armed men down on their heads. I'll go, Rosalie said immediately. She'll come quietly for me, and I can move through the building without the guards recognizing me as quickly. Too dangerous, Chaska replied. If something goes wrong. If something goes wrong, at least I'll die trying to save my daughter instead of hiding in a basement. Rosalie cut him off. You can't own a child's future with forged ink and spilled blood, and I won't let Kensington try. Before anyone could argue further, she was moving up the stairs with the fluid silence of someone whose life depended on not being heard. The jail's main floor was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, and she could see 2 guards playing cards at a table near the front door. A third man dozed in a chair, tilted back against the wall. Daisy's cell was at the far end of the corridor, and reaching it meant crossing an open area where any of the guards could spot her with a casual glance. But the alternative was leaving her daughter in the hands of men who had already proven they would kill children to protect their secrets. She made it halfway across the room before disaster struck. The sleeping guard's chair slipped, and he jerked awake with a startled curse that brought his companion's attention immediately to the intruder creeping through their domain. "Hey!" one of them shouted, reaching for his gun. "We got company." Rosalie abandoned stealth for speed, sprinting toward Daisy's cell as the guards scrambled to respond. Behind her, she could hear boots pounding up the basement stairs as Chaske and the others realized the rescue had gone wrong. What followed was a brief but vicious gun battle in the confined space of the jail. Chaske's rifle boomed in the narrow corridors, while Conrad and the civilian prisoners tried to shepherd themselves toward the basement exit. 2 of the guards went down immediately, but the third managed to get off a shot that splintered wood inches from Rosalie's head as she reached her daughter's cell. "Mama!" Daisy cried out, pressing against the bars with tears streaming down her face. "I knew you'd come. I'm here, sweetheart," Rosalie said, working frantically at the lock while gunfire continued behind her. "Everything's going to be all right." But even as she spoke the words, she could hear shouts from outside as the battle attracted attention from Kensington's other men throughout the town. They had perhaps minutes before the jail was surrounded by overwhelming force. The lock finally yielded, and Daisy flew into her mother's arms with desperate relief. But their reunion was cut short by Conrad's urgent voice from the basement stairs. "They're coming," he called out. "At least 20 men moving this way fast." It was then that Dr. Malcolm made his choice. As they reached the basement entrance, he suddenly stopped and turned back toward the stairs leading to the main floor. "Doctor," Winifred called out, "what are you doing?" Malcolm's face was pale but determined, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "I have to tell you something," he said rapidly. "Something I should have said from the beginning." Chaske spun around, rifle-ready, sensing betrayal even before the words were spoken. "Kensington has my nephew." Malcolm continued, the words pouring out in a rush. "My sister's boy, taken from a boarding school in Denver 3 months ago. He said he'd kill the child if I didn't cooperate, if I didn't tell him when you came to me for help." His hands shook as he reached into his medical bag. "I sent word when you arrived this morning. I'm sorry, God forgive me, I'm so sorry." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Their trusted ally had been compromised from the beginning, forced into betrayal by the same ruthless tactics Kensington used against everyone who opposed him. "You led them to us?" Chaske said, his voice deadly quiet. "Yes," Malcolm admitted, tears streaming down his face. "But I can make it right. I can give you time to escape." Before anyone could stop him, he pulled a stick of dynamite from his medical bag, the kind miners used for blasting, and held up a lit match. "This will bring down the front of the building block their advance long enough for you to get away. It's the only thing I can do to balance the scales." "Doctor, no!" Winifred screamed, but Malcolm was already moving toward the stairs, the burning match held steady despite his trembling hands. "Tell my nephew I tried to be worthy of him in the end," he called back. "And Mrs. Brennan, your husband, didn't die in an accident. Kensington had the mine support sabotaged. Patrick found something in that canyon that was worth more than silver, and it cost him everything. The explosion that followed brought down half the jail and sent debris flying across the street. In the chaos and confusion, they managed to escape through the tunnel system, but the cost was devastating. Dr. Malcolm was dead, buried under the rubble of his own sacrifice, and his final revelation had added new urgency to their desperate flight. The escape became a running battle through the underground passages, with Kensington's men pursuing them into the darkness with torches and guns. The confined space worked both for and against them, and their enemies couldn't bring their numerical advantage to bear effectively. But there was also nowhere to run, if they were cornered. They emerged from the tunnel system at the edge of town, near the creek where their horses waited. But dawn was breaking, and their escape had not gone unnoticed. Riders were already moving to cut off their retreat, while others worked to surround their position. Straight through them. Chasky decided, checking his weapons with the calm efficiency of someone who had faced impossible odds before. Stay close together, protect the civilians, and don't stop for anything. What followed was the most terrifying ride of Rosalie's life. With Daisy clinging to her and bullets whining through the air around them, they charged through Kensington's closing trap with desperate courage and skill. Conrad managed to pull his sister Anna up behind him as her horse went down with a bullet in its chest, while Winifred rode with grim determination despite having no experience with such violence. George Morrison wasn't so lucky. A rifle shot took him high in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle to land hard on the rocky ground. For a moment, Rosalie thought they would have to leave him. But Chaska wheeled his horse around and rode back into the gunfire to collect the wounded man. By the time they cleared the immediate danger, half their group was wounded and all of them were exhausted. But they were alive, and they were free. And ahead of them lay Bronze Canyon, the place where all of this had started and where it would finally end. How long before they follow? Winifred asked, clutching her father's service revolver despite a bullet graze across her arm. Not long, Chaska replied grimly. Kensington can't afford to let us reach the canyon. He knows as well as we do that it holds the proof of his crimes. As they rode through the morning light toward their final confrontation, Rosalie held Daisy close and tried not to think about Dr. Malcolm's sacrifice, or about all the ways this could still end badly. Behind them, a column of dust marked their pursuers' approach, and she knew that by sunset, one side or the other would be dead. But Patrick's final secret, the truth about what he had really found in Bronze Canyon, drove her forward with new determination. Her husband had died for that knowledge, and Dr. Malcolm had given his life to ensure it could be revealed. She would not let their sacrifices be in vain. The hobby horse bounced against Daisy's chest as they rode its carved features, seeming to watch the trail ahead with patient wisdom. Soon at Bronze Canyon, all debts would be paid and all secrets revealed. The only question was whether any of them would survive to see justice finally served. Bronze Canyon looked different in the harsh light of early afternoon, more forbidding and treacherous than Rosalie remembered from her few previous visits. The narrow path down into the ravine seemed designed for ambush, while the steep sides offered no escape route for anyone caught in the bottom. But it was also the one place where they might find evidence strong enough to prove Kensington's guilt beyond any doubt. And if they were going to die, at least they would die fighting for truth rather than running from lies. There, Daisy said suddenly, pointing to a spot about 100 yards from the current mine entrance. That's where I found the horse, in those burnt timbers. Chaske followed her gaze, and his expression grew grim. Tikala's winter shelter. He built it where the canyon provided natural protection from wind and weather. But the mine workings have expanded far beyond where Patrick was originally digging. Conrad observed his sister Anna clinging to him as they surveyed the scene below. Someone has been extracting material on an industrial scale. They made their way down the treacherous path, leading their horses and helping the wounded members of their group navigate the steep descent. At the bottom, the evidence of extensive recent work was overwhelming, and this was no small-scale silver mining operation. The office building was larger and more substantial than Rosalie had expected, built with the permanence of something meant to last for years. When Conrad's keys proved effective once again, they found themselves in a treasure trove of documents that painted a devastating picture of corruption and murder. Gold. Winifred breathed, examining a geological survey report. High-grade ore worth more than $500,000, according to this assay. Augustine, when was the survey done? Chask asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. 3 months after Patrick Brennan's death, Winifred replied. But there are references to earlier surveys dating back more than a year before he died. The implications hit Rosalie like a physical blow. If Kensington had known about the gold before Patrick's death, then her husband's accident took on a much more sinister character. The forged guardianship papers suddenly made perfect sense as a way to gain legal control over what might be the richest claim in Dakota territory. "Here's more," Anna said in her heavily accented English. Conrad's sister had been examining correspondence files with the thoroughness of someone who understood the value of careful documentation. Letters from officials in Denver discussing bribes and falsified reports. The letters detailed a systematic campaign of fraud and corruption, with Kensington paying territorial officials to suppress information about gold strikes, while he quietly acquired claims through violence and intimidation. Patrick Brennan's property was specifically mentioned as a significant obstacle that needed to be removed permanently through appropriate action. "Murder," George Morrison said flatly despite the bullet wound in his shoulder. "They killed him for the gold, then tried to steal his daughter's inheritance through fraudulent legal proceedings. And when that didn't work fast enough, they decided to simply take the girl by force and eliminate all witnesses." Rosalie added, her voice tight with rage and grief. From outside came the sound of horses and shouting voices. Their pursuers had arrived, and from the volume of noise it sounded like Kensington had brought his entire force to finish this once and for all. "How many?" Chaske called to Wikasa, who was keeping watch from behind the office building. 30, maybe more. And they've got the supposed federal marshals with them, along with some men I don't recognize, professionals by the look of them. The final confrontation was about to begin, but now they had evidence that could destroy Kensington's empire if it ever saw the inside of an honest courtroom. The question was whether they would live long enough to present it. "Brennan." Kensington's voice boomed down into the canyon. "I know you're down there. Come out with your hands up and maybe we can work something out." Chaske moved to a position where he could see the rim without exposing himself to rifle fire. "We have something you might want to see: Kensington documentary evidence of fraud, bribery, and murder." "I don't know what you're talking about." But there was something in Kensington's voice, a note of uncertainty that suggested he knew exactly what they might have found. "Then you won't mind if we show these papers to a federal judge?" Chaske called back. The silence that followed was telling. When Kensington spoke again, his tone had changed completely. "You're not leaving that canyon alive," he said with cold finality. "None of you. Too much depends on keeping certain secrets buried with the people who dug them up." "Then you'd better come down and bury us yourself," Chaske replied. "Your paper law ends where our land begins, and this ground has already seen too much blood for lies to take root." What followed was unlike anything Rosalie had ever experienced. Instead of charging down the narrow path where they could be picked off one by one, Kensington's men began a systematic siege designed to trap them in the canyon bottom until thirst and ammunition forced surrender. Rifle fire rained down from the rim, forcing them to take cover behind rocks and mine equipment, while sharpshooters tried to pick them off with careful aimed shots. Anyone who showed themselves for more than a few seconds drew immediate attention from multiple directions. But the attackers had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated both the determination of their quarry and the defensive advantages of the terrain. The canyon's steep sides worked both ways, making it difficult for the defenders to escape, but also limiting the angles from which they could be attacked effectively. Chaske organized their defense with the skill of someone who had fought many such battles. The wounded were placed in the most protected positions, while those still capable of fighting took up positions that maximized their fields of fire. Every shot had to count because ammunition was limited and there would be no resupply. They're trying to work around to the north side. Conrad reported, pointing to where several figures could be seen moving along the canyon rim. If they get positions up there, they'll have clear shots at our main cover. Wikasa, take 2 men and discourage them, Chaske ordered. Anna, how are our wounded? The young German woman had taken over medical duties after Dr. Malcolm's death, using skills learned from her grandmother back in the old country. George is stable but can't fight effectively. Miss Winifred has a flesh wound that won't kill her but hurts considerably. Everyone else is functional for now. The battle continued through the afternoon, with each side probing for weaknesses while avoiding decisive action that might tip the balance. But Rosalie could see the calculation in Chaske's eyes. They were outnumbered more than 3 to 1, their ammunition was limited, and night would bring new dangers. As if reading her thoughts, Kensington's voice echoed down from the rim as shadows began to lengthen. "Getting dark down there, isn't it?" he called mockingly. "Don't worry, we've got torches and plenty of time. Sooner or later you'll run out of bullets or make a mistake, and then we'll finish this." But darkness brought unexpected salvation. As the last light faded from the sky, new sounds echoed across the canyon, the thunder of many horses approaching at speed, accompanied by shouts and commands in distinctly military tones. "Cavalry." George Morrison breathed. "Someone's brought in the army." For a moment, Rosalie's heart leaped with hope. If federal troops had arrived to restore order, surely they would investigate the situation fairly and discover the truth about Kensington's crimes. But the conversations she could hear from the rim quickly crushed that hope. The cavalry commander was clearly receiving his briefing from Kensington himself, and the story being told was one of hostile Indians and civilian hostages, violent criminals and federal authority under attack. "Looks like we're about to become the villains in someone else's story," Chaske said grimly. That was when Conrad made his choice. Rising from cover, despite the obvious danger, he began climbing toward the rim with his hands raised, shouting in his accented English for the soldiers' attention. "Wait, don't listen to him. There are things you need to know." Rifle fire from Kensington's men tried to silence him, but he kept climbing and shouting until he reached a position where the cavalry could see and hear him clearly. What followed was a tense negotiation conducted by shouted voices in the darkness, with Conrad serving as an increasingly desperate intermediary between the trapped defenders and the newly arrived military force. The boys telling them about the documents, Winifred reported listening intently to the exchanges above. And I think some of the soldiers are starting to ask uncomfortable questions about why they're being asked to attack American citizens without a proper hearing. The deadlock continued through the night, but when dawn broke, it brought unexpected visitors descending into the canyon under a flag of truce. A tall man in military uniform led the group, accompanied by another man in expensive civilian clothes who carried himself with unmistakable authority. "I'm Colonel Patterson, commanding officer at Fort Meade," the soldier announced. "And this is Judge Harrison from the Territorial Court. We're here to investigate some very serious allegations about fraud, corruption, and abuse of federal authority." What followed was not the gun battle everyone had expected, but a legal proceeding conducted in the harsh light of a Dakota Territory morning, while armed men from both sides watched nervously from their positions. The documents told their story in dry legal language, but the implications were explosive. Geological surveys proving the mine's true value, correspondence detailing systematic corruption, and most damning of all, letters that revealed Patrick Brennan's death as a carefully planned murder, disguised as an accident. Testimony was given, evidence was examined, and slowly the full scope of Kensington's crimes became clear. Conrad spoke about the threats against his sister and the systematic abuse of immigrant workers. Anna provided translations of letters that revealed the extent of official corruption. George Morrison, despite his wounds, offered testimony about the economic intimidation that had plagued the region. And through it all, Daisy sat quietly beside her mother, clutching the rawhide hobby horse that had started the entire chain of revelations. The toy that Chikala had carved with love for children he would never see grow up had finally served its purpose. It had brought justice for both the Lakota warrior and the Irish miner, who had died for another man's greed. When Judge Harrison finally announced his decision, the sun was well up and the canyon was filled with armed men from both sides who had been waiting to learn whether they would be fighting or going home. Hugh Kensington. The judge said formally, "You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and murder. Your claims to guardianship over Daisy Brennan are hereby declared null and void, and all mining rights you have claimed through fraudulent means are subject to immediate seizure and investigation." The aftermath was swift and decisive. Faced with federal troops and legitimate legal authority, most of Kensington's hired guns simply melted away, abandoning their employer to save themselves. The supposed federal marshals turned out to be imposters carrying forged credentials, while the real corruption reached all the way to the territorial capital. Kensington himself seemed to age years in minutes as the full reality of his situation became clear. His empire of violence and intimidation had crumbled in a single morning brought down by a child's toy and the courage of people who refused to be silenced by threats and violence. As the various officials prepared to escort their prisoners back to town for formal processing, Chaske found himself standing beside Rosalie at the edge of the canyon, looking out over the grassland where their desperate flight had finally ended in vindication. "It's over," she said, hardly able to believe it herself. "This part is over." Chaska agreed. "But there will be trials and testimony legal proceedings that could take months to resolve completely." "Will you stay?" she asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. "I mean, will you be available to testify when they need you?" Chaska was quiet for a moment, watching the federal officers organize the complex logistics of justice in a frontier territory. "I will stay as long as truth requires," he said finally. "And perhaps longer than that, if there is reason to build something new from what remains." Their eyes met, and Rosalie felt something pass between them that had been building since their first desperate meeting in the Lakota camp. It was not the passionate romance of penny novels, but something deeper and more enduring. A partnership forged in shared danger and proven through hardship. "There will always be reasons," she said simply. "Some foundations are worth building on, even after everything else has been torn down." Behind them, Daisy played with her hobby horse, while Conrad and Anna talked quietly about their plans for a new life, free from fear and exploitation. Winifred was documenting everything for the historical record she was already planning to write, while George Morrison rested against a rock, finally allowing his wounds to be properly tended. Life was reasserting itself after the violence and terror, and Rosalie realized that for the first time since Patrick's death, she could imagine a future that held more than mere survival. Bronze Canyon would indeed make her and Daisy wealthy, but more importantly, it had given them something precious: justice, and the knowledge that truth could triumph even over the most powerful corruption. The hobby horse caught the morning sunlight as it moved in Daisy's hands, its carved features seeming almost alive with the spirit of the brother who had shaped it with such love and skill. Chikala's gift to unknown children had finally completed its journey, carrying with it the enduring proof that simple acts of kindness and craftsmanship could change the world in ways that no one could predict or control. As they prepared to leave Bronze Canyon behind, and return to whatever new life awaited them in Willow Springs. Rosalie knew that they were not just survivors of violence and corruption, but witnesses to the power of ordinary people to demand justice when those in authority failed in their duties. Dr. Malcolm's sacrifice had not been in vain. His final act had given them the time they needed to escape and find the evidence that brought down Kensington's empire. His betrayal, born of love for his nephew and fear for the child's safety, had been redeemed by his willingness to pay the ultimate price for his mistakes. The truth, once spoken clearly and backed by courage, could never be silenced again. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the American frontier, other families were building new lives on the foundation of that truth, secure in the knowledge that right would ultimately triumph over might, no matter how long the struggle or how powerful the forces arrayed against it.